We're going to talk to Ben Peters of the Washington Business Journal, who joins us now. Ben, you wrote and did some legwork and some research on something that means a lot to our listening audience, which is the idea that DC is trying to find some money to put together the plans to build a new football stadium for the Commanders. So, first of all, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Hey, thanks for having me.
You got it.
Absolutely.
If you want to check out the WBJ online, you could do so. And Ben's on Twitter at Newsman Ben. So all kinds of follow ups coming your way, but just give us the deets here first. Give us the lead of the story.
Yeah, so the district had hired a consultant via a contract. They awarded this contract to a company called ASM Global, which is an entertainment facilities management firm. They manage a handful of NFL stadiums, and they basically handed this firm about $500,000 and said, "Hey, we want to bring the Commanders back to Washington. Can you draw up a really detailed plan for how we can do that and how we can pay for it?"
So help me understand something, Ben. What did they pay Jack Evans and his consulting firm for earlier this year? Wasn't it for the exact same thing? So now we're about $1 million into whatever this is.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure on the details of that one. I was not covering this at the time.
Got it.
But my understanding is that was, are you referring to the JLL and Robert Bob Group plan?
I think so.
In 2023.
I will full admission here. I like talking about like curveballs and long passes. This is not my area of expertise, but I remember and I went back and read Jack Evans, who was forced to resign years ago in amid scandal, is right back in the thick of it, and he and his consulting firm were paid, I think it was $400,000. I thought for the exact same thing that you just laid out for the feasibility or how could we lure the football team back to DC. So again, I was wondering if there's a distinction that you knew about.
Yeah, no, I don't think I can speak to that. I really only know the details of this specific contract. And this was asking this firm again to not necessarily determine the feasibility of it, but to say like, hey, what do we need to do in order to make the numbers on this check out for the district? Like, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to, attract the NFL here? It wasn't so much the feasibility as it was like a little bit more finer details of it. I think that by hiring this consultant, they've said that, hey, we do kind of think it's feasible. We want you to show us more details about that.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear that this contract that they did to get this information is the most concerted effort, as you called it, so far to bring the team back to DC. So this feels like a pretty big deal. Can you expound upon that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, it's again just the district asking another firm to come up with ideas for them. But they're putting their money where their mouth is. And it's clear that the Bowser administration really wants to bring the Commanders back to DC, specifically at RFK.
I just wonder how they'll do it. And I guess that's what they're trying to figure out also. But after giving the money to Ted Leonsis and the Monumental Sports Group to stay in DC after their Virginia deal went sideways, and by the way, supposedly as of last week, that paperwork had not really been finished yet, according to Eric Flack of Channel 90 we had on the show. I don't know if they've made any progress on that. It seemed like a formality, but they were in a little bit of a spat over some final details, I guess. But with that money shelled out, what we've been told by people who are smart and follow this like you all along is it's going to be really hard for them to have both. Like they said they didn't have the money for the Wizards and the Capitals. They found $500 million. Now we're talking about funding a stadium for the Commanders. How would they do both? Where's the money come from?
Yeah, I don't know. And I think that might be answered a little bit more clearly whenever this consulting firm finishes up their report and sends it back to the district. Again, right now, this is just the district paying this consulting firm to write this report and I think answer that very question. So I think that's kind of TBD.
Ben Peters, Washington Business Journal, with us here on Grant and Danny. A couple of elements sort of outside this story, but as it very much relates to it, Ben, are included in here. Eleanor Holmes Norton one of the co-sponsors of the bill that would ultimately return control of the land to Washington, D.C. Again, there should probably be more moving parts at some point, but said it's still maybe a toss-up as to whether this would even go through or not. What can you tell us about that and how the district's handling it?
Yeah, how the district's handling it, I'm not sure. But what I can say is that there's uncertainty about whether or not this bill is going to clear the Senate. There's been some opposition on both sides of the aisle, particularly with Maryland senators about not wanting to advance this. They want to keep the commanders in Maryland and not bring them into D.C.
The other secondary part of that, in terms of some of the obstacles, is you mentioned that the local opposition, I guess, kind of did this thing as well. But how far along do they have to have the planning and documentation and feasibility in case things do break their way at the part that's out of their control? Does that make sense? So in other words, the federal government finally says yes, and there's no more strings attached. How far along do they have to be in order for this thing to start moving?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so I know it's confusing. So in other words, they're doing a feasibility study now. I keep saying feasibility. It's probably not the right word, but
say feasibility one more time.
I'll try to say feasibility more, Ben. So they're trying to figure out if this is possible, how we're going to pay for it. How far along do they have to be once they get the green light from the federal government that they do indeed have the land to use at their disposal?
That is a good question. I don't know.
Our guest has the story as of yesterday that the Commanders have hired the firm that they struck a deal with to try to get some details on how they would go about, I should say that the city, on how they would go about landing the Commanders again at the old RFK site. Ben Peters is with us from the Washington Business Journal. Last thing for me, I'm curious about would be a nugget in this story about Eleanor Holmes Norton, the delegate in D.C., who says that she believes the bill in the Senate is a toss-up. We've heard that today due to regional opposition. Well, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, to me, that's the lead of the whole thing, right? I mean, are we still at a point where they might not even get the ability to build a stadium because they can't get it back from the federal government?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, that is one of, if not the biggest holdups right now, standing in the way of this happening before we even start talking about financing and site plans and all that. It's the district right now does not control RFK. And the only way that they can do that is with congressional approval.
My last one for you here, Ben, is previously on the record. I don't know how much has changed, if at all, but the council chair, Phil Mendelson, said this year he does not support public financing for a stadium. Do you know if anything's changed in that regard, if that's still a stance, or where does that stand?
I have not reached out to the council member's office, but I can say that generally speaking, him along with other members of the council have been pretty clear in that they do not want to spend public dollars on a new stadium.
Ben Peters, Aaron Grant, and Danny, we appreciate the time. Thanks for the info.
Yeah, no, sure thing.
Thanks, Ben.
You got it. Feels like a pretty large development on the old stadium front. But to me, the biggest deal of this story, because inevitably they were going to do this research, they were going to find a way to spend the money to get the stadium. You had to get that intel, and that's what they're doing. As you said, they've already been working on this. They spent $500,000 to do this before, it seems like. Are you going to get the bill passed federally that even gives you the right as the city to build a stadium? We are still waiting to find that out. This is the Steve Daines in Montana telling you he doesn't want you to have the team. This is, you still got some people in Maryland lined up to tell you they don't want to vote to give you the rights to that land back. If Eleanor Holmes Norton is saying it's a toss-up that they even get the land back, none of this matters, which seems like a lot still to be determined as to whether or not you can even build the thing. Can you get the money? How much are taxpayers going to shell out? Do they even want to do that? Are people going to be willing to pay for it?
Yeah.
Those are all hurdles. But before we run hurdles on that track, we have to beat the boss, Steve Daines and company, and just be allowed to get on the track, which still seems 50-50 in and of itself.
Yeah, it is a mess. And this was my point all along, not necessarily each individual motion or beat, is that this is so astoundingly complicated, talking about RFK. The people years ago that were just like, it'll be an RFK. It might be. It may yet be. But counting chickens, we're not even at an egg phase yet. We're before, whatever's before egg, we're there. right? Like this is always so necessarily complicated because of that relationship that's so unique here that's unlike anywhere else. That federal government, local government control, not control. Then you get the person that gets to go, well, I'm going to use this chance to play politics or to stand up and give some sort of huge speech to try to increase my profile to get in the way. It's harder here than it is anywhere else. And that's not just anecdotal. That's not just like my opinion or like kind of how it feels. It is because, again, nowhere else do you have the federal government being like, your territory where you sit, you don't own that. You know what I mean? When you want to build a new stadium in Oklahoma, there's no federal government going, yeah, but this is federal land or whatever that you're trying to do. We may give it back to you, but there's like 77,000 political things that are happening. Local politics happens everywhere, but stuff can get done a lot more efficiently when you have the relationship or you don't have the relationship that exists here.
That's the main reason I think why it's harder to get a stadium done here. I would add, though, there's no other place where you have 3 municipalities all involved in any kind of discussion. You have plenty of places where there are 2, like the Chiefs are a great example. The Royals right now. Kansas and Missouri both want the new stadiums that are being built. The ballpark for the Royals, the stadium for the Chiefs. And so they're going through the same kind of thing we are. We're on Sports Talk Radio 610 out there. They're talking about what's better, Kansas, Missouri. People in Kansas don't want it in Missouri and vice versa. The Virginia, Maryland thing. We have 3 because we've got DC in it too. I think that only further complicates it and adds to the conversation. But you know how I feel about this, and I know I'm in the minority on this. I just don't think it's worth it. I don't think waiting years potentially, and I don't mean like 10, but another 2 years, let's say, maybe as much as 3, hopefully not. I don't think that the juice is worth the squeeze. I think that the best part of really there's 2 areas of going into DC with the Commanders that resonate the most. One is that DC sports teams being in DC is a good thing, and that it's centrally located for Virginia, for Maryland, for DC residents, all 3 of whom claim the teams. And that because you're in the city, you're going to be able to use public transportation at a greater rate than the others. But just having the DC teams in DC makes a lot of sense. I think that should be everybody's preference. It's certainly my preference. Secondarily, I think that having the teams in DC makes a lot of sense because the folks that are in Virginia that won't drive all the way out to the FedEx Field location and the folks that are out in Landover that want nothing to do with going out to Loudoun County can't complain if the commute's cut in half. But it's not worth it to me. No, it's mostly a nostalgia play anyway. And the vast majority of the people that are going to be buying tickets over the next 20 years didn't go to RFK and don't really have any memories of RFK. Initially, this year, next year, the first 5 years of the stadium, the people that are putting their names down on deposits have some memories, I think. But that will be gone and changed within 5 to 7, 10 years of that stadium opening. The people with the income that are making the money, that are working in the city and around DC, mostly in their 30s and 40s with the young disposable, whatever that is, like that base of your fans, RFK doesn't mean anything more to them than a great stadium in Virginia or Maryland. Do they want to be in DC? Maybe. That's why it's my preference. But I just don't think it's worth all of the extra hassle and wait.
Which I get. I mean, to me, my thoughts are slightly different. And then I get to a very different conclusion, but I'll get there in a second. To me, it's less about being in DC. That doesn't move me one way or the other. Some people
You don't think there's an added appeal to the DC team being in the city?
I don't care about that all that much. I go, oh, that's nice. Like it's like an ice cream sundae without a cherry. To me, it's a cherry on top. Oh, that's cool.
So the aerial shot of the Capitol and the monument over top of the stadium doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, if it was at National Harbor, I'd still get that shot, right? But where it is now, I don't get the shot.
Yeah.
To me, the most important part about calling it RFK or somewhere else is that it's central. It's central to everybody. Instead of one side of the fan base, what I still think is the majority of the fan base, even though I get shouted down and screamed at about this. But to me, one side of the fan base, the Northern Virginia side, this is a Northern Virginia team that's headquartered there. The ad sales there, the partnerships there, the season ticket spaces there. I know that there's Maryland fans. I'm not saying there aren't. But that Northern Virginia side has always had to wear it. They've had to go the furthest, and they continue to have to go the furthest. Now, if we move it into Virginia, Virginia getting a stadium, I'm sorry, I was doing a joke. But let's say it was in Virginia, keep a straight face. Then the Maryland side would have to wear it for a little while, and they would cry and get all angry about it, but whatever. It's centrally located.
No,
So
I'm sure they'd be very reasonable and they wouldn't be bothered going across the river.
everyone's got to compromise a little bit going into DC, right?
Yeah.
DC residents do, Maryland residents, Virginia residents. That's why everyone has to give a little
It
bit,
makes
and that's the most
sense
satisfaction.
geographically.
That's my
It's
point.
centered.
So,
but also I think public transportation
yeah,
there,
all of it. The infrastructure's there, yeah.
for a lot of reasons. I also think, and I've experienced this with the defenders of the XFL, now the UFL, in the Navy Yard. The walk up from the city afternoon that you've been having, right?
Yep.
Where you may have parked somewhere near the mall and walked this way, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you parked right here in the Navy Yard. The Capitol's off in the background though, and you're on South Capitol Street as you're walking down to the arena, and you're eating the stadium, and you're eating at sports bar right here in the Navy Yard, or you're going and grabbing your pizza on the water over on the Anacostia.
Mm-hmm.
Like that does appeal to me more than even the town center that I always talk about being built, like this man-made town center with restaurants. It looks like Reston or something, or Kingstown or something that's like right at a stadium. Obviously, the city's the better play. I'm not saying that the ceiling isn't the highest at the RFK
No,
site,
I know.
but it's got to be way, 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 way better for me to want to add 2 more horrendous years. Because everyone that just says, oh, 2 years, what's that? How many times do you go out to the terrible stadium? I'm there every Sunday. How often are you sending your kids and your wife there to have a terrible experience? We do it all the time. My wife's a season ticket holder. So it's real easy for people that don't go to the stadium to tell me, wait a few more years and get the RFK site. Kick rocks. I'm so tired of going to that place. It stinks so bad.
I get it.
It's so expensive and it's so awful and it's the worst in the sport. No, 1 more minute there is a terrible minute. 1 more hour there is a stupid plan. It is not worth another 2 seasons at that terrible stadium to have the games at RFK to me. I'm in the minority. I get that. Give me the amazing new thing faster, immediately. And get it right 20 years from now if you want to. But right now, oh, by the way, there's no guarantee that it's even going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
By waiting.
That's the other part.
The extra year or 2, there's no way you know what's going to happen.